Hi everyone, this video is made for relaxing and sleeping to the sounds of rain and scary stories. I wish you all a pleasant viewing. Freak Island, A Tale of Horror and Mystery Part 1, The Quest begins. In a remote corner of the vast Pacific Ocean lies a small, uncharted island that the locals call Freak Island. The name alone is enough to send shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned sailors. Stories abound of strange creatures, twisted and malformed, haunting its dense jungles and rocky shores. Few dare to venture near, and those who do often never return. Marcus Thorne, a young and ambitious journalist, was always drawn to the macabre and unexplained. When he heard whispers of the island during a late-night tavern visit in a coastal town, his curiosity was piqued. Determined to uncover the truth, Marcus decided to embark on what he believed would be the story of a lifetime. Securing passage to the island was no easy feat. Most boat captains refused to go near it, citing cursed waters and lost ships. After days of searching, Marcus finally found an old fisherman named Joe who agreed to take him. Joe's eyes held a haunted look as he warned Marcus. "I've been near that island before, lad. It's no place for the living. But if you're determined, I'll take you. Just promise me you'll be careful." Part 2, Arrival. The journey to the island was treacherous. The seas were rough, and the skies grew darker the closer they got. Joe's small boat was tossed about by the waves, but he navigated with a practiced hand. As they approached the island, a thick fog rolled in, shrouding it in an eerie gloom. Marcus could barely make out the outline of the island through the mist. Jagged rocks jutted out of the water, and a dense, tangled jungle covered the land. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant cries of unseen creatures. Joe dropped anchor a few hundred yards from shore. "This is as close as I go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be back in 3 days. If you're not here, I won't wait. Good luck, lad. You'll need it." With that, Marcus climbed into a small rowboat and made his way to the beach. His heart pounded with a mix of excitement and fear as he set foot on the cursed land. Part 3, The First Night. Marcus set up camp near the beach, choosing a spot that provided a clear view of both the jungle and the sea. As night fell, he lit a small fire and began to review his notes. He planned to document everything he saw and heard, hoping to piece together the island's dark secrets. The first night was uneventful. Marcus heard the usual sounds of the jungle, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal animals. But as the hours passed, a deep sense of unease settled over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. In the early hours of the morning, just as he was drifting off to sleep, Marcus heard a strange noise. It was a low, guttural moan, unlike anything he'd ever heard before. He grabbed his flashlight and camera, heart racing, and ventured into the jungle to investigate. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted trees and dense undergrowth. The moaning grew louder, closer. Suddenly, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned, and his flashlight fell upon a figure. It was humanoid, but its body was grotesquely deformed. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over misshapen bones. Its eyes were hollow, empty pits, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The creature stumbled towards him, its movements jerky and unnatural. Marcus stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. He took a few quick photos before turning and running back to camp. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of his fire, panting and trembling. He spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching his flashlight and watching the jungle. Part 4, Discovering the Past. The next morning, Marcus awoke to the light of dawn filtering through the trees. The events of the previous night felt like a nightmare, but the photos on his camera were proof that it was real. Determined to uncover more, he packed his gear and ventured deeper into the jungle. As he explored, Marcus found more signs of human activity: old, rusted equipment, crumbling buildings, and faded signs warning of danger. He stumbled upon what appeared to be an abandoned research facility, overgrown with vines and moss. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dark interior. Inside, the air was stale and musty. Dust covered the floors and surfaces, and broken glass crunched underfoot. Marcus explored room after room, finding old lab equipment, charts, and documents. One document caught his eye, a journal, partially intact, detailing the experiments conducted on the island. The entries were chilling. They spoke of attempts to alter human DNA, to create beings with enhanced abilities. But something had gone horribly wrong. The subjects began to mutate, their bodies twisting into monstrous forms. The scientists had lost control, and the island became a living nightmare. Marcus read on, horrified. The journal detailed how the experiments continued in secret, even as the situation grew worse. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, written in shaky handwriting. "We have created monsters. God forgive us." Part 5, The Horrors Unleashed. As Marcus continued his exploration, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The jungle seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. He heard whispers on the wind, faint and indistinct, as if the island itself were alive. One day, as he was examining a particularly large building, he found a hidden trapdoor. It led down into a dark, subterranean chamber. Marcus descended cautiously, his flashlight flickering in the damp, oppressive air. The chamber was a maze of tunnels and rooms, filled with more abandoned equipment and horrifying sights. He found cells with heavy iron bars, some of them still containing the skeletal remains of the unfortunate test subjects. The walls were covered in scratch marks and dried blood. In the deepest part of the chamber, Marcus discovered a large, reinforced door. It took all his strength to pry it open, revealing a massive, underground laboratory. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls were lined with glass tanks containing the mutated bodies of the island's former inhabitants. As he explored the lab, Marcus found more journals and documents. They detailed the final days of the facility, when the creatures had broken free and slaughtered the remaining scientists. The experiments had spiraled out of control, and the island had become a prison for the monstrous creations. Suddenly, Marcus heard a noise behind him. He turned, flashlight trembling, and saw a group of the creatures emerging from the shadows. They were grotesque, their bodies twisted and deformed, their eyes filled with a mix of pain and anger. Part 6, The Escape. Panic surged through Marcus as the creatures advanced. He backed away, trying to find an escape route. The creatures moved slowly, but their sheer numbers and horrifying appearance filled him with dread. Marcus stumbled upon a set of emergency stairs leading to the surface. He climbed as fast as he could, the creatures following close behind. He burst out into the daylight, blinded by the sudden brightness. Without pausing to catch his breath, he ran towards the beach. The jungle seemed to come alive with the sounds of pursuit. Branches snapped, and leaves rustled as the creatures closed in. Marcus could see Joe's boat anchored offshore, a beacon of hope in the nightmare. As he reached the beach, he shouted for Joe. The old fisherman, seeing the terror in Marcus's eyes and the creatures behind him, quickly started the engine and steered the boat towards the shore. Marcus waded into the water, the creatures' guttural moans growing louder behind him. He clambered into the boat just as Joe pulled alongside. The creatures stopped at the water's edge, their hollow eyes watching as the boat sped away. Epilogue. Back on the mainland, Marcus struggled to come to terms with what he had experienced. He published his story, complete with photos and journal entries, but many dismissed it as fiction. The island remained shrouded in mystery, a dark secret hidden in the ocean's depths. Marcus was forever changed by his encounter with Freak Island. Nightmares haunted his sleep, and the whispers of the island echoed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the island's horrors were not confined to its shores, that they might one day escape and spread their darkness to the world. And so, the legend of Freak Island lived on, a tale of terror and madness, waiting to ensnare the next curious soul who dared to uncover its secrets. The Meatpacking Horror, Part 1. The Abandoned Plant. In a small, forgotten town in the Midwest stood an old meatpacking plant, long abandoned and shrouded in eerie legends. The plant, once a thriving hub of activity, had fallen into disrepair after a series of gruesome accidents and mysterious disappearances. Locals whispered about the plant being cursed, and no one dared to enter its decaying walls. Sam, a thrill-seeking urban explorer, had heard the stories and decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, camera, and a sense of adventure, he made his way to the decrepit building on a cold, moonless night. As he approached, the air grew thick with the stench of rotting meat, and a chill ran down his spine. The massive iron gates stood ajar, creaking ominously in the wind. Sam pushed them open and stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty courtyard. Broken windows and rusted machinery loomed around him, casting long shadows in the dim light. Part 2. Inside the plant, The main entrance was blocked by debris, but Sam found a side door that led into the heart of the plant. The interior was even more foreboding than the outside, with dark corridors lined with broken tiles and walls smeared with old, dried blood. The smell was almost unbearable, a mix of decay and something far more sinister. Sam switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. He made his way through the plant, documenting the eerie scene with his camera. He found old meat hooks, rusty conveyor belts, and massive freezers that still hummed with a faint, unnatural energy. In one of the rooms, he discovered a series of old photographs pinned to the wall. They depicted the plant in its heyday, bustling with workers. But there was something off about the images. The faces of the workers were blurred, and their eyes seemed hollow. The last photo showed a shadowy figure standing in the background, almost imperceptible, yet menacing. Part 3, The First Encounter. As Sam moved deeper into the plant, he began to hear strange noises, faint whispers, the sound of metal scraping against metal, and occasional thuds. He brushed it off as the building settling, but the unease in his stomach grew stronger. In a large processing room, Sam found a giant meat grinder, still slick with old grease and blood. The air was frigid, and he could see his breath in the flashlight's beam. Suddenly, the room grew deathly silent, and he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, and his flashlight beam fell on a grotesque figure standing in the shadows. It was a hulking creature, covered in matted fur and dried blood. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. Sam froze in terror as the creature let out a guttural growl and lunged at him. He barely managed to dive out of the way, the creature's claws scraping against the metal floor. Sam scrambled to his feet and ran, the creature's heavy footsteps echoing behind him. Part 4, The Hunt. Sam darted through the labyrinthine corridors of the plant, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the creature's guttural breaths and snarls as it pursued him relentlessly. He tried to lose it by weaving through rooms and hiding behind old machinery, but it seemed to always be one step behind. In his frantic flight, Sam stumbled upon a control room filled with old, dusty monitors and switches. Desperately, he slammed the door shut and barricaded it with a heavy chair. He took a moment to catch his breath, the creature's growls reverberating through the door. The control room provided a brief respite, but Sam knew he couldn't stay there forever. He scanned the room for anything that could help him escape. On one of the dusty monitors, he saw a schematic of the plant, highlighting an emergency exit at the far end of the building. Gathering his courage, Sam prepared to make a run for it. He pushed the chair away and cautiously opened the door, peering into the dark corridor. The creature was nowhere in sight, but he could still hear its distant growls. Part 5, The Descent. Following the schematic, Sam made his way through the plant, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The emergency exit was in the basement, and he had to navigate a series of narrow staircases and tunnels to reach it. The deeper he went, the colder and darker it became. In the basement, the stench of decay was overwhelming. Sam's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He could hear the faint drip of water and the occasional skittering of rats. The emergency exit was just ahead, a heavy metal door marked with a faded exit sign. But as he approached the door, the creature's growls grew louder, echoing through the tunnel. Sam's heart raced as he fumbled with the door. But it was locked. Panic set in as he turned to face the darkness, the creature's glowing eyes appearing at the far end of the tunnel. Desperate, Sam scanned the room for another way out. He noticed a narrow vent near the ceiling, just big enough for him to squeeze through. He grabbed a nearby crate and climbed up, prying the vent cover off with trembling hands. Part 6, The Final Stand. Sam crawled through the vent, the metal walls pressing in on him. He could hear the creature clawing at the door behind him, its snarls growing more frantic. The vent was a tight squeeze, and Sam's progress was slow and arduous. After what felt like an eternity, he emerged into a small room filled with old, dusty crates and tools. He was back on the main floor of the plant, but the emergency exit was still a long way off. He could hear the creature's distant roars as it searched for him. Determined to escape, Sam made his way through the plant, using every ounce of his strength and willpower to keep moving. He finally reached the main hall, the emergency exit just ahead. But the creature was there, blocking his path. Sam's eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything he could use to defend himself. He spotted an old fire axe hanging on the wall and grabbed it, his hands shaking. The creature snarled and lunged at him, its claws outstretched. With a primal scream, Sam swung the axe, striking the creature's arm. It howled in pain and fury, but Sam didn't stop. He swung again and again, driving the creature back. Finally, with a powerful blow, he buried the axe in the creature's skull. The creature let out a final, agonized roar and collapsed, its body twitching before falling still. Sam stood over it, panting and covered in blood. The plant was silent once more, the only sound the echo of his ragged breaths. Epilogue. Sam staggered to the emergency exit and pushed the door open, the cold night air washing over him. He stumbled out into the courtyard, the sky beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. He had survived, but the horrors of the plant would haunt him forever. In the days that followed, Sam shared his story with anyone who would listen, but few believed him. The old meatpacking plant remained abandoned, a dark and foreboding presence in the town. Locals continued to whisper about the curse, and no one dared to venture inside. Sam knew the truth, though. He had faced the terror that lurked within the plant and lived to tell the tale. But he also knew that some horrors could never be truly defeated, only contained. And as long as the plant stood, the creature's evil would never be fully vanquished. Years later, the plant was finally demolished, its ruins buried and forgotten. But the memories of that night remained with Sam, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. And though the plant was gone, the legend of the meatpacking horror lived on, a chilling tale passed down through generations, warning of the terrors that can arise from man's darkest experiments. The Village That Never Was, Part 1, The Arrival. In the heart of the vast Siberian wilderness, there was a legend of a village that appeared only to those who were lost. This village, known as Nesashesvishi, or the Village That Never Was said to be a haven for lost souls, offering shelter and warmth to travelers who had strayed from their path. But those who found it were never seen again. Alexei, a seasoned hiker and survivalist, had heard the legend many times but dismissed it as folklore. He prided himself on his ability to navigate the harsh Siberian terrain and had planned a solo expedition deep into the wilderness. One cold, foggy morning, he set out with a backpack full of supplies, a map, and his trusty compass. The first few days of the journey were uneventful. The dense forests and rugged mountains were challenging, but Alexei was confident. However, on the fourth day, a sudden blizzard swept through the region, obscuring his path and disorienting him. Despite his best efforts, he soon realized he was hopelessly lost. As night fell and the temperature plummeted, Alexei stumbled upon a narrow, winding path that seemed to lead somewhere. Desperate for shelter, he followed it. After several hours of trudging through the snow, he saw a faint light in the distance. As he approached, he could make out the outlines of quaint wooden houses, their windows glowing warmly. Part 2, The Village. Exhausted and freezing, Alexei entered the village. The first thing he noticed was the eerie silence. There were no sounds of life, no barking dogs, no chatter from the houses, only the howling wind. He knocked on the door of the nearest house, and it creaked open, revealing a cozy interior with a roaring fire. An old woman, her face lined with age and wisdom, greeted him with a kind smile. "Welcome, traveler. You must be cold and hungry. Come in and rest." Grateful for the hospitality, Alexei stepped inside. The warmth was comforting, and the smell of freshly baked bread made his stomach growl. The old woman, who introduced herself as Baba Yelena, offered him a hot meal and a place to sleep. As he ate, Alexei asked about the village. Baba Yelena's expression grew somber. "This is Nesashesvishi, a place for those who are lost. You are safe here, but remember, this village is not what it seems." Her words sent a chill down Alexei's spine, but fatigue soon overcame him, and he fell into a deep sleep. Part 3, Strange Occurrences. The next morning, Alexei woke to find the village bustling with activity. Men and women went about their daily chores, and children played in the snow. Everyone seemed friendly, but there was an underlying sense of unease that Alexei couldn't shake. As he explored the village, he noticed peculiar things. The villagers avoided talking about their past or how they came to be there. There were no roads leading out of the village, and the surrounding forest seemed impenetrable. Every attempt Alexei made to leave the village resulted in him circling back to the same spot. Days turned into weeks. and Alexei began to realize that the village had a strange effect on time. His sense of days and nights blurred, and he couldn't remember how long he had been there. The villagers, too, seemed trapped in a loop, repeating the same actions day after day. One night, while wandering the village, Alexei heard a soft humming coming from the old church at the village's edge. Curious, he entered the church and found Baba Yelena kneeling before the altar, chanting in a language he didn't understand. Part 4. The Revelation. Baba Yelena turned to him, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. You should not be here, Alexei. This village exists between worlds, a refuge for lost souls. But it comes at a price. Those who stay here can never leave. Alexei felt a surge of panic. I have to get out of here. There must be a way. Baba Yelena sighed. There is one way, but it is dangerous. You must find the heart of the village, a place hidden deep within the forest. There, you will face the guardian of Nesashestveshy. If you defeat it, you may break the curse and leave. Desperate, Alexei agreed. Baba Yelena gave him a map and a small, intricately carved dagger. This will protect you. Go now, before it's too late. Part 5. The journey into the forest. Armed with the map and the dagger, Alexei ventured into the forest. The path was treacherous, filled with twisted trees and thick underbrush. As he moved deeper, the forest seemed to come alive, shadows shifting and whispers echoing through the trees. After what felt like hours, Alexei reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive, ancient tree with a hollow trunk. He knew this was the heart of the village. Steeling himself, he stepped inside. The hollow opened into a cavernous space, dimly lit by an eerie, bluish light. At the center of the cavern was a pool of dark water, and beside it stood a creature unlike any Alexei had ever seen. It was tall and humanoid, but its skin was pale and translucent, its eyes black voids, and its hands ended in sharp claws. The creature hissed, its voice echoing in the cavern. You dare to challenge me, human? Part 6. The battle. Alexei gripped the dagger tightly, his heart pounding. The creature lunged at him with blinding speed. He dodged, barely avoiding its claws. Remembering Baba Yelena's words, he thrust the dagger at the creature, aiming for its heart. The blade pierced the creature's skin, and it let out a blood-curdling scream. Black, viscous blood oozed from the wound as the creature staggered back. But it wasn't defeated yet. It swiped at Alexei, catching him across the chest and sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain seared through Alexei, but he forced himself to stand. He knew he had to end this. Summoning all his strength, he lunged at the creature again, this time driving the dagger deep into its heart. The creature let out one final, agonized scream before collapsing into a pool of darkness. The cavern began to tremble, and the eerie light faded, replaced by the warm glow of dawn. Epilogue. The escape. Alexei stumbled out of the forest, the village of Nesashestveshy nowhere in sight. He found himself at the edge of the Siberian wilderness, the familiar landscape a welcome sight. The curse had been broken, and he was free. He returned to civilization, his ordeal in the village that never was etched into his memory. He shared his story with anyone who would listen, but most dismissed it as a fanciful tale. Despite the skepticism, Alexei knew the truth. Nesashestveshy remained a legend, a mysterious place that existed between worlds. And though Alexei had escaped its grasp, he could never forget the horrors he had faced and the lost souls he had left behind. The Basement Door, Part 1. The new home. Tom and Lisa were a young couple who had just bought their first home, an old Victorian house in a quiet, rural town. They were thrilled with their purchase, charmed by the house's character and its sprawling, overgrown garden. The house had been vacant for several years, and while it needed some work, they saw it as a project they could take on together. The first few weeks were spent cleaning and making minor repairs. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes in the basement, Tom noticed a door he hadn't seen before. It was a heavy, old wooden door at the far end of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of old furniture. Curious, he called Lisa over. Hey, have you seen this door? Tom asked. Lisa shook her head. No, I haven't. It must have been blocked off by the furniture. Tom tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It's locked. Maybe we should leave it for now, Lisa suggested, feeling an odd sense of unease. Tom nodded, but the mystery of the door lingered in his mind. Part 2. The Key. A few days later, while cleaning the attic, Tom found an old, rusty key in a small wooden box. Something about the key made him think of the locked door in the basement. Excited, he rushed downstairs to try it out. Lisa watched nervously as Tom inserted the key into the lock. With a bit of effort, the key turned, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into a deeper part of the basement. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Come on, it's just another part of the house." Tom reassured her, grabbing a flashlight. They descended the stairs together, the air growing colder with each step. The flashlight beam revealed a long, narrow hallway lined with old wooden beams. The walls were damp, and the smell of mold was overpowering. At the end of the hallway, they found another door. This one was made of metal, with strange, intricate carvings. Tom reached out to open it, but Lisa grabbed his arm. "Tom, I have a bad feeling about this," she whispered. Tom hesitated but then pulled the door open. The room beyond was small and bare, except for an old wooden chest in the center. Part 3. The chest. The chest was covered in dust and cobwebs, and it looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Tom wiped away the dirt and opened it. Inside, they found a collection of old, yellowed papers and a small, leather-bound book. Lisa picked up the book and started to read. It was a diary, written by a previous owner of the house. The entries detailed strange occurrences and unexplained events that had plagued the family. The final entry was particularly chilling. "The door in the basement must never be opened. We have sealed it to keep the darkness contained. To whoever finds this, heed our warning, do not disturb what lies beyond." Lisa's hands trembled as she closed the diary. "We need to leave this alone, Tom. This is serious." But Tom was fascinated. "It's just an old diary. There's probably a logical explanation for everything." Part 4. The darkness. That night, strange things began to happen. They heard footsteps echoing through the house, and doors that they knew had been closed were found ajar. The temperature in the house dropped suddenly, and they both felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Lisa woke up in the middle of the night to find Tom standing at the basement door, staring at it with a blank expression. "Tom, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. He turned to her, his eyes vacant. "I don't know. I just felt like I had to come here." They decided to lock the basement door and throw away the key, hoping to put whatever was happening behind them. But the strange occurrences only grew worse. They started seeing shadows moving in the corners of their eyes and hearing whispers that seemed to come from the walls. One evening, Lisa found herself drawn to the basement door. Despite her fear, she felt compelled to go down there. She grabbed the flashlight and descended the stairs alone. When she reached the metal door at the end of the hallway, it was open. The chest in the room was also open, and the papers and diary were scattered on the floor. Lisa picked up the diary, and as she did, a cold hand grabbed her wrist. She screamed and turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow. "You should not have opened the door," the woman whispered. "Now it is too late." Part 5. The escape. Lisa bolted up the stairs, her heart pounding. She found Tom in the living room, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here," Lisa gasped. Tom nodded, and they both rushed to gather their things. As they were about to leave, the lights in the house flickered and went out. The temperature dropped even further, and they could hear the sound of heavy footsteps coming up the basement stairs. They ran to the front door, but it wouldn't open. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The footsteps grew louder, and they could feel a presence closing in on them. "Tom, what do we do?" Lisa cried. Tom grabbed a fireplace poker and stood in front of Lisa, ready to defend them from whatever was coming. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then, the basement door burst open, and the figure of the woman emerged, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She reached out towards them, her fingers long and claw-like. "Leave this place," she hissed, "or suffer the same fate as those before you." With a surge of adrenaline, Tom swung the poker at the woman, but it passed right through her. She let out a shriek, and the house began to shake. The walls cracked, and the floorboards splintered. Realizing they had no other choice, Lisa grabbed the diary and threw it into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, consuming the pages. The woman let out a final, piercing scream before disappearing into a cloud of smoke. Epilogue: the house fell silent, and the temperature returned to normal. The front door swung open, and Tom and Lisa fled into the night. They drove away, not looking back, until they reached the next town. They never returned to the old Victorian house, and it soon fell into ruin. The locals avoided it, calling it cursed. Years later, the house was demolished, but the legend of the basement door persisted. Tom and Lisa moved to a new city, trying to forget the horrors they had experienced. But every now and then, they would wake up in the middle of the night, haunted by the memory of the cold, dark basement and the figure that had warned them to leave, and they would wonder, in the quiet moments before dawn, if they had truly escaped the darkness that lay beyond the door. The Doll in the Attic Part 1, The Discovery. Lena and her family moved into an old, colonial-style house in a small, sleepy town. The house was charming and full of history, with creaky wooden floors and a sprawling attic that had been left untouched for decades. As the family settled in, Lena's curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to explore the attic. The attic was dusty and filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten trinkets. While rummaging through a trunk of old clothes, Lena stumbled upon an ornate wooden box. It was intricately carved with strange symbols and locked with a rusty latch. With some effort, she managed to pry it open. Inside the box was an old porcelain doll. The doll had piercing blue eyes, curly blonde hair, and a delicate, almost lifelike face. It was dressed in a faded, elegant gown. Despite its age, the doll was in remarkably good condition. Lena, enchanted by its beauty, decided to keep it and named it Emily. Part 2, The Unease. From the moment Lena brought Emily into her room, strange things began to happen. At night, she heard faint whispers and the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom door. Objects in her room would move or go missing, only to reappear in odd places. Lena's younger brother, Max, was the first to notice the doll's unsettling presence. He claimed that he saw the doll's eyes following him around the room and swore that its expression would change when no one was looking. Lena dismissed his fears as childish imagination, but deep down, she felt an inexplicable sense of unease. One evening, while Lena was brushing her hair, she caught a glimpse of Emily in the mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw the doll's lips move. Shaken, she quickly turned around, but the doll sat motionless on the shelf, its blank eyes staring into space. Part 3, The History. Determined to uncover the truth about the doll, Lena began researching the history of the house and its previous owners. She discovered that the house had once belonged to a wealthy family in the late 1800s. Their young daughter, Emily, had died under mysterious circumstances. Shortly after her death, the family left the house, leaving behind all their possessions. Lena found an old newspaper article detailing Emily's death. It mentioned that the little girl had been found lifeless in her room, clutching her favorite doll. The cause of death was never determined, and rumors of a cursed doll began to circulate in the town. Part 4, The Haunting. As Lena delved deeper into the doll's history, the disturbances in the house intensified. The whispers grew louder, and the footsteps became more frequent. Lena's parents, initially skeptical, began to experience the strange occurrences themselves. Doors would slam shut on their own, and cold drafts would sweep through the house, even in the middle of summer. One night, Lena woke up to find Emily sitting at the foot of her bed. Terrified, she threw the doll back into the attic, hoping to put an end to the haunting. But the next morning, the doll was back on the shelf in her room, its expression more sinister than ever. Desperate, Lena contacted a local historian and paranormal expert, Mrs. Hawthorne. Mrs. Hawthorne visited the house and immediately sensed a malevolent presence. She explained that the doll was a vessel for Emily's restless spirit, trapped between worlds and unable to find peace. Part 5, The Exorcism. Mrs. Hawthorne suggested performing a cleansing ritual to release Emily's spirit. The family gathered in the attic, where the doll had originally been found. Mrs. Hawthorne set up candles and incense, chanting ancient prayers to summon Emily's spirit. As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the attic dropped, and the air grew thick with tension. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the doll's eyes began to glow with an unnatural light, and a cold wind swept through the room. Emily's spirit manifested, appearing as a translucent figure of a young girl. Her eyes were filled with sadness and longing. She reached out towards the doll, her voice echoing through the attic. "Please let me go," she whispered. With a final, powerful chant, Mrs. Hawthorne completed the ritual. The doll shattered into pieces, and Emily's spirit slowly dissolved into the air, leaving behind a feeling of peace and warmth. Epilogue. After the exorcism, the disturbances in the house ceased, and the family was finally able to settle in without fear. Lena often thought about Emily and the tragic story of the little girl trapped in the doll. She hoped that Emily had finally found the peace she deserved. The house, once filled with eerie whispers and cold drafts, was now a warm and welcoming home. Lena kept one of the shards of the broken doll as a reminder of the strange events that had brought her closer to her family and the history of their new home. Years later, Lena would tell the story of the haunted doll to her own children, warning them of the power that objects can hold and the importance of respecting the past. And although the doll was gone, the memory of Emily and her tragic tale would live on, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that sometimes lie just beneath the surface of everyday life. The Garage with the Basement, Part 1. The move. Max and his best friend Peter had always been drawn to the thrill of adventure. When Max's family moved to a new house on the outskirts of town, the two friends were excited to explore the area. The house was old and had a detached garage that came with a mysterious basement. From the moment they saw it, they knew they had to investigate. Max's parents warned them to be careful. The garage and basement hadn't been used in years and were likely full of hazards. But the allure of the unknown was too strong for Max and Peter to resist. Part 2. The Discovery. One Saturday afternoon, the boys decided to explore the garage. Armed with flashlights and a sense of excitement, they pried open the rusty garage door. Inside, they found old tools, boxes of forgotten belongings, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. In the back corner of the garage, they discovered a heavy, wooden door leading to the basement. The door was locked, but Max found an old key hanging on a nail nearby. With some effort, they managed to unlock the door and descended the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and strange, unidentifiable objects. As they shone their flashlights around, they noticed an old, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. It seemed out of place among the dusty relics. Peter, always the braver of the two, approached the mirror and wiped away the grime. As he did, a chill ran down his spine. The reflection in the mirror showed not just the two boys but also a shadowy figure standing behind them. Part 3. The Haunting. Startled, Peter turned around, but there was no one there. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease and called Max over to show him the mirror. Max, too, felt a cold shiver as he looked into the glass. They both decided it was time to leave the basement. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Max would hear faint whispers when he was alone, and objects in the house seemed to move on their own. Peter experienced similar phenomena at his home. They realized that they might have disturbed something in the basement. Determined to get to the bottom of it, they decided to do some research. They visited the local library and found an old newspaper article about the previous owner of the house, a reclusive man named Mr. Henderson. The article mentioned that Mr. Henderson had been obsessed with the occult and had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Rumors suggested he had conducted dark rituals in the garage basement. Part 4. The Ritual. The boys returned to the basement, armed with the knowledge they had gathered. They found an old, dusty book on a shelf that detailed various occult rituals. The book's final chapter described a ritual to summon and trap spirits using a mirror. It became clear that Mr. Henderson had used the mirror to trap a malevolent spirit, and the boys had inadvertently released it. Max and Peter knew they had to perform the counter-ritual to banish the spirit and restore peace. They gathered the necessary items, candles, salt, and an incantation written in the book. As they began the ritual, the temperature in the basement dropped, and the shadowy figure from the mirror appeared, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. The boys recited the incantation, their voices trembling with fear. The spirit grew more agitated, its form becoming more defined. It lunged at Peter, knocking him to the ground. Max continued chanting, hoping to complete the ritual before it was too late. Part 5. The Struggle. Peter struggled to his feet, pain coursing through his body from the fall. He grabbed a piece of broken furniture and swung it at the spirit, trying to buy Max more time. The spirit howled in rage, its form flickering as it fought to remain in the physical world. Max could see that Peter was hurt, but they had to finish the ritual. With a final, desperate effort, Max shouted the last words of the incantation. The candles flickered and then flared brightly, casting the spirit into a blinding light. It let out a final, piercing scream before dissolving into nothingness. The basement fell silent. Max rushed to Peter's side, helping him up. Peter was covered in bruises and had a deep gash on his arm. But he was alive. Epilogue: the boys stumbled out of the basement and into the daylight, grateful to be free of the malevolent presence. Max's parents, alarmed by their injuries, took them to the hospital. Peter received stitches for his wound and treatment for his bruises. The doctors were puzzled by the extent of his injuries but attributed them to a fall. Max and Peter decided never to speak of the events in the basement again. They agreed to stay away from the garage and its dark history. The mirror was removed and destroyed, ensuring that no one else would fall victim to its sinister power. As time passed, the strange occurrences ceased, and life returned to normal. But Max and Peter would always carry the memory of that terrifying encounter. A reminder of the dangers that can lurk just beyond a door left unopened for too long. The Night Knocker, Part 1, The New Home. Sarah and her husband, Mark, had always dreamed of living in a quiet, picturesque village away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Their dream came true when they found a charming old cottage on the edge of a small, idyllic town. The cottage was surrounded by dense woods, adding to its serene beauty. They moved in during late autumn, enjoying the tranquility and the friendly, welcoming neighbors. The nights were especially peaceful, with only the sounds of nature filling the air. But as winter approached, the nights grew longer and colder, and a strange unease began to settle over the cottage. Part 2, The First Knock, One Chilly Night. Just as Sarah and Mark were settling into bed, they heard a faint knock on the front door. It was a slow, deliberate knocking that echoed through the quiet house. They exchanged puzzled glances, wondering who could be visiting at such a late hour. Mark went to the door and peered through the peephole, but saw no one. He opened the door slightly and looked outside, but the porch and the yard were empty. Shaking his head, he closed the door and returned to bed, dismissing it as a prank or perhaps the wind playing tricks. But the knocking continued over the next few nights, always at the same time, midnight. Each time Mark checked, there was no one there. The pattern persisted, and they began to feel a growing sense of dread. Part 3, The Legend. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Sarah decided to ask their neighbors if they had experienced anything similar. She visited Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly woman who had lived in the village her entire life. When Sarah mentioned the knocking, Mrs. Abernathy's face turned pale. "You've heard the night knocker," she whispered. "It's an old legend around here. They say a spirit wanders the village at night, knocking on doors, looking for someone to let it in." Sarah's skin prickled with fear. "What happens if someone lets it in?" Mrs. Abernathy shook her head. "No one knows for sure. But the stories say that those who do are never seen again." Part 4, The Investigation. That night, Sarah and Mark stayed up, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, was knocking on their door. They set up a camera on the porch, aimed directly at the front door, hoping to capture footage of the mysterious visitor. At midnight, the knocking started again. Slow, deliberate, and insistent. They watched the camera feed on their laptop, but to their horror, the porch was empty. The knocking grew louder, echoing through the house, yet there was nothing on the screen. Suddenly, the camera feed flickered, and the image distorted. For a brief moment, they saw a shadowy figure standing at the door, its face obscured. Then the feed went black. Panic set in as the knocking grew more aggressive, shaking the door on its hinges. Part 5, The Confrontation. Mark grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. Sarah stayed behind, clutching her phone, ready to call for help. As Mark opened the door, the knocking stopped. He shone the flashlight into the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty yard and the edge of the woods. "There's no one here," he called back to Sarah, but the words had barely left his mouth when he felt an icy breath on his neck. He turned around, and standing in the doorway was the shadowy figure from the camera feed. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. Its presence exuded a palpable sense of malevolence. Mark stumbled back, his heart pounding. The figure stepped forward, crossing the threshold. Sarah screamed and ran to Mark's side. Together, they backed away from the entity, which seemed to glide rather than walk. Its eyes, dark and empty, locked onto theirs. "You must not let it in!" Mrs. Abernathy's words echoed in Sarah's mind. Gathering her courage, she grabbed the door and slammed it shut, trapping the figure outside. The knocking resumed, more furious than ever. Part 6. The Escape. Realizing they couldn't stay in the cottage, Sarah and Mark decided to flee. They gathered a few essential items and bolted out the back door, racing towards their car. The knocking followed them, echoing through the night, as if the entity was pursuing them. They drove to Mrs. Abernathy's house, desperate for help. She let them in and listened to their story with grave concern. "You must leave the village," she advised. "The night knocker won't stop until it finds what it's looking for." Sarah and Mark nodded, their fear palpable. They decided to leave the village for good, seeking refuge with relatives in the city. As they drove away, the knocking faded, but the memory of the shadowy figure haunted them. Epilogue. Months passed, and Sarah and Mark settled into their new home far from the village. The terror of the night knocker became a distant memory, something they rarely spoke of. But every now and then, late at night, they would hear a faint, familiar knocking in their dreams, and wake up in a cold sweat. The village, too, returned to its quiet routine, though the legend of the night knocker persisted. New families moved into the old cottage, unaware of its dark history. The knocking eventually started again, and the cycle of fear and mystery continued. Sarah and Mark never returned to the village, but the experience left a lasting mark on them. They learned to appreciate the mundane safety of everyday life, and never took the warmth of their home for granted. And they never forgot the chilling nights when a malevolent spirit knocked on their door, seeking entry into their lives. And in the quietest moments, when the wind howled through the trees, they sometimes wondered if the night knocker would ever find what it was looking for, or if it would forever roam the night, searching, knocking, and waiting for someone to answer. The Bunker in the Woods, Part 1, The Discovery. It was the summer of 1987 when four friends, Jack, Laura, Mike, and Sarah, decided to spend their vacation in a remote cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was owned by Jack's uncle, who had warned them about the eerie stories surrounding the area, but the friends shrugged it off as old tales meant to scare children. One sunny afternoon, while exploring the dense forest, they stumbled upon a hidden path overgrown with weeds. Intrigued, they followed it until they reached a rusty, iron door set into a small hill. The door was half buried under a thick layer of dirt and leaves, but it was clear that it hadn't been opened in years. They had discovered an old bunker. Part 2, The Entry. The group debated whether to enter the bunker. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to explore it. Jack, being the strongest, managed to pry the door open with the crowbar they found in the cabin. A musty, metallic smell wafted out as the door creaked open, revealing a dark stairwell leading down into the earth. Armed with flashlights, they cautiously descended the stairs. The air grew colder and damper as they went deeper. At the bottom, they found themselves in a long, narrow corridor lined with doors on either side. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor was littered with debris. Part 3, The Haunting. The first room they entered appeared to be an old storage area, filled with rusted cans and broken equipment. As they moved deeper into the bunker, they discovered what seemed to be living quarters, bunk beds, a small kitchen, and a common area. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, untouched for decades. In the back of the bunker, they found a door marked "Restricted." It was locked, but Mike managed to pick the lock with a hairpin. Inside, they discovered a small laboratory filled with strange equipment, and shelves lined with jars containing unidentifiable substances. On a dusty desk, they found an old journal. The journal belonged to a scientist named Dr. Richard Marlowe, who had been conducting experiments in the bunker during the Cold War. The entries grew increasingly erratic, detailing his descent into madness. He wrote about hearing whispers in the dark and seeing shadowy figures moving just out of sight. The final entry was scrawled hastily. "I have to finish it before they find me. The voices, they won't stop. They're coming for me." Part 4, The Unraveling. Disturbed by the journal, the friends decided to leave the bunker. As they made their way back to the stairs, they heard a faint whisper echoing through the corridor. It sounded like someone calling their names. Their flashlights flickered, and the temperature dropped further. Panic set in as they realized they weren't alone. Shadows moved along the walls, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. They hurried up the stairs, but the iron door slammed shut before they could reach it. They were trapped. Laura suggested they retrace their steps to find another way out, As they ventured deeper into the bunker, the whispers turned into blood-curdling screams. The shadows became more defined, resembling ghostly figures with hollow eyes. Part 5. The confrontation. They stumbled upon a room they hadn't noticed before. It was filled with strange, arcane symbols drawn on the walls and floor. In the center of the room was a large stone slab with chains and manacles. It looked like some sort of ritualistic altar. The air was thick with a sense of dread. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut, and the ghostly figures materialized fully. They were the spirits of Dr. Marlowe and his unfortunate test subjects, their faces twisted in agony. The friends realized that the experiments conducted in the bunker had unleashed something truly malevolent. The spirits circled them, their wails piercing the air. Jack, driven by a surge of adrenaline, grabbed an old iron rod and swung it at the spirits. To their surprise, the rod passed through the spirits, but the symbols on the walls began to glow. The spirits recoiled, as if the symbols were holding them back. Part 6. The escape. Sarah, the most intuitive of the group, realized that the symbols were a form of protection against the spirits. She quickly instructed the others to draw the symbols on themselves using the chalk that lay scattered on the floor. The spirits hesitated, their forms flickering. With the spirits momentarily held at bay, they searched the room for any other exit. Behind a bookshelf, they found a hidden door. It led to a narrow, winding tunnel that seemed to go on forever. They had no choice but to follow it. The tunnel was claustrophobic and seemed to close in around them. The screams and whispers followed, growing fainter but never completely fading. After what felt like hours, they emerged into the forest, far from the bunker. The fresh air was a welcome relief. Epilogue. The friends never spoke of the bunker again. They left the cabin the next day, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows and whispers haunted their dreams, a constant reminder of their brush with the unknown. Years later, Jack returned to the area out of morbid curiosity. The path to the bunker had vanished, swallowed by the forest. It was as if the bunker had never existed. But he knew better. The spirits of Dr. Marlowe and his victims were still there, waiting in the darkness for the next unwary souls to stumble upon their resting place. And the whispers in the night continued, carried by the wind through the trees, echoing with the torment of souls trapped in a bunker lost to time. The Abandoned Asylum. Part 1. The urban legend. In the small town of Hollowbrook, there was an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts that had long been the subject of local legends and ghost stories. Known as Hollowbrook Asylum, it had been shut down in the late 1960s after numerous allegations of inhumane treatments and mysterious patient deaths. The townspeople avoided the area, and it quickly fell into disrepair, becoming overgrown and forgotten. Despite the warnings, the asylum attracted thrill-seekers and ghost hunters from time to time. Most left with only eerie stories and a sense of unease, but no one had ever stayed long enough to uncover its darkest secrets. Part 2. The Dare. One chilly autumn night, a group of friends, Alex, Jamie, Lily, and Ben, decided to explore the asylum. It was Jamie's idea, sparked by a dare from a mutual friend. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and a backpack full of snacks and drinks, they made their way to the derelict building. The asylum loomed before them, its broken windows like empty eyes watching their approach. The front doors hung ajar, creaking in the wind. The friends hesitated at the threshold, exchanging nervous glances, but Jamie, always the bravest, stepped inside first. The others followed, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Part 3. The Exploration. Inside, the asylum was a maze of crumbling hallways and decaying rooms. Peeling paint hung from the walls like ghostly drapes, and the air was thick with dust and mildew. They explored cautiously, their footsteps echoing eerily through the empty halls. They found old medical equipment, rusted and broken, scattered across the floors. Patient records, yellowed with age, lay strewn about, detailing treatments that seemed more like torture. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. As they turned a corner, they found themselves in front of a heavy metal door marked Ward C. This was the ward where the most dangerous and disturbed patients had been kept. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped through the gap. Jamie pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. Part 4. The Haunting. Ward C was in worse condition than the rest of the asylum. The walls were covered in strange symbols and cryptic messages scratched into the paint. The friends felt an overwhelming sense of dread as they moved through the ward. their flashlights flickering. They entered what appeared to be a common room. In the center of the room was a large, circular table covered in old blood stains. Chairs were overturned, and the remnants of a fire lay in the corner. Suddenly, they heard a faint whispering sound, like voices carrying on the wind. It seemed to come from all directions. Lily felt a chill run down her spine and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind them with a loud bang. Panic set in as they tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, and shadows seemed to move in the corners of their vision. Ben, trying to stay calm, suggested they look for another exit. They ventured deeper into the ward, the sense of being watched growing stronger. They entered a room that had once been used for electroshock therapy. The equipment lay in rusted heaps, and the smell of burnt flesh still lingered in the air. Part 5. The Revelation. In the corner of the room, they found a hidden door leading to a narrow staircase descending into the darkness. With no other option, they cautiously made their way down. At the bottom, they discovered a secret basement level that wasn't on any of the asylum's blueprints. The basement was a network of cells and small rooms, all filled with old, rusted medical equipment and strange devices. It became clear that this was where the asylum's darkest experiments had taken place. They found journals detailing horrific treatments and experiments conducted on the patients, written by a Dr. Harold Grant, the asylum's head psychiatrist. The journals revealed that Dr. Grant had been obsessed with curing mental illness through extreme methods, including lobotomies and experimental drugs. His writings grew increasingly deranged, suggesting that he believed he could communicate with the dead through his patients. As they read the final entries, the friends heard footsteps approaching. They turned to see the ghostly figure of a man in a white lab coat standing in the doorway. His eyes were hollow, and his face twisted in a malevolent grin. It was Dr. Grant, or what was left of him. Part 6. The Escape. The friends bolted from the room, their fear driving them through the maze-like basement. The ghostly doctor pursued them, his presence causing the air to grow colder and the lights to flicker. They reached a dead end, but Ben noticed a loose panel in the wall. With a desperate push, they broke through, finding themselves in an old service tunnel. They ran through the tunnel, hearing the doctor's laughter echoing behind them. The tunnel led them to an old, rusty ladder that climbed up to a hatch. They scrambled up, emerging into the forest behind the asylum. Gasping for breath, they ran through the woods until they reached the safety of their car. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away from the asylum, vowing never to return. Epilogue. Back in town, they told their story to a local historian who confirmed the dark history of Hollowbrook Asylum. Dr. Grant had indeed conducted horrific experiments, and was believed to have gone mad before his mysterious disappearance. The asylum was closed shortly after, and the true extent of his atrocities was never fully uncovered. The friends never spoke of the asylum again, but the experience left a permanent mark on them. They couldn't forget the ghostly figure of Dr. Grant, and the whispers that still haunted their dreams. The abandoned asylum remained, a decaying monument to madness and cruelty, and a place where the echoes of the past refused to rest. And in the quietest nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear the whispers of the patients and the laughter of Dr. Grant, lingering in the shadows of Hollowbrook Asylum. The Cemetery Visit. Part 1. The Dare. It was a cold October evening when John and Eric, two high school friends, found themselves bored and restless. They had been friends since childhood and shared a love for thrill-seeking and adventure. On this particular night, they decided to venture into the old cemetery on the outskirts of their small town. The cemetery was rumored to be haunted, and the local legends only added to its allure. "Are you sure about this?" John asked, looking at the overgrown path leading to the cemetery gate. Eric grinned, holding up his phone to capture the moment. "Come on, it'll be fun. We'll take some pictures, maybe catch a ghost on camera. Besides, it's just an old cemetery." With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, they set off down the path, the moonlight casting eerie shadows through the trees. Part 2. The Entrance. The cemetery gate creaked open with a sound that sent shivers down their spines. Inside, the air was colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring the tombstones. The friends stepped through the gate, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. "Let's stick together," John suggested, feeling a growing sense of unease. They wandered among the graves, reading the inscriptions and marveling at the age of some of the tombstones. Many were cracked and weathered, covered in moss and ivy. As they ventured deeper, the fog grew thicker. and the night seemed to grow darker. Part 3. The Discovery. Near the center of the cemetery, they stumbled upon an old, decrepit mausoleum. The entrance was partially covered by vines, and the stone door was ajar. Eric's curiosity got the better of him, and he pushed the door open, revealing a dark interior. "Let's check it out," he said, stepping inside. John hesitated but followed, his flashlight revealing dusty coffins and cobwebs. The air was musty and filled with the scent of decay. As they explored the mausoleum, they found an old journal lying on a stone pedestal. The cover was cracked and faded, but the pages were surprisingly intact. Eric opened the journal and began to read aloud. It belonged to a caretaker named Thomas, who had worked at the cemetery in the late 1800s. The entries detailed strange occurrences, unexplained noises, moving shadows, and sightings of ghostly figures. The final entry was particularly disturbing. "I can hear them whispering at night. The dead are restless, and they call my name. I fear I am losing my mind. If anyone finds this journal, beware. Do not disturb their rest." A chill ran down their spines as they read the words. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the mausoleum, causing them to jump. Part 4. The Haunting. They turned to see the mausoleum door had slammed shut. Panic set in as they tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature dropped further, and they heard faint whispers echoing through the chamber. Their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We need to get out of here," John said, his voice trembling. They searched for another exit but found none. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Eric's flashlight caught a figure standing in the corner, a ghostly apparition of an old man, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "It's Thomas," Eric whispered, recognizing the description from the journal. The ghostly figure pointed towards the back of the mausoleum, where they found a hidden trapdoor. Desperate to escape, they pried it open and descended into a dark tunnel beneath the cemetery. Part 5. The Escape. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the walls covered in roots and dirt. They crawled through, their flashlights barely illuminating the way. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more insistent. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning. Just when they thought they couldn't go any further, they saw a faint light ahead. They emerged into an old crypt, the air stale and suffocating. In the center of the crypt was an ancient, ornate coffin. The lid was slightly open, and inside they saw the skeletal remains of Thomas, clutching a rusted key in his bony hand. Eric reached for the key, hoping it would open the mausoleum door, but as he touched it, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The crypt shook, and the ghostly figure of Thomas appeared once more, his face twisted in anger. "You should not have come here," the ghost hissed. "You have disturbed the rest of the dead, and now you must pay." The friends backed away, their hearts pounding. The walls of the crypt began to close in, and the air grew colder. In a desperate bid to escape, they grabbed the key and ran back through the tunnel, the ghostly figure pursuing them. Part 6. The Confrontation. They reached the mausoleum and tried the key on the door. To their relief, it worked. They pushed the door open and stumbled out into the cemetery, gasping for breath. The fog had lifted, and the moonlight illuminated the graves in an eerie glow. But the ghost of Thomas was not far behind. He emerged from the mausoleum, his spectral form growing more menacing. The whispers filled the air, and the ground began to tremble. "We have to make it to the gate," John shouted. They sprinted towards the cemetery gate, but the ghost was relentless. Tombstones cracked and crumbled as they ran past, and ghostly hands seemed to reach out from the ground. Just as they reached the gate, Thomas grabbed Eric's arm, his touch freezing cold. John turned back, grabbed a large stick, and swung it through the ghost. The spectral figure dissipated momentarily, giving them just enough time to escape through the gate. They didn't stop running until they were far from the cemetery, the ghostly whispers fading into the distance. Epilogue. Back in the safety of their homes, John and Eric couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They had survived their encounter with the restless spirits, but the experience left a lasting mark. They vowed never to return to the cemetery and warned others to stay away. But the legends of Hollowbrook Cemetery continued to grow, and the whispers of the dead persisted, waiting for the next curious souls to venture into their domain. And on quiet nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear the mournful cries of Thomas and the restless spirits, forever haunting the shadows of the old cemetery. Thanks for watching. Best wishes for success to all.